A very warm welcome to the new episode of Incan Insights. This is your host Sumit Sarmar Samir. This is a Nepal-based podcast, and if you are interested listening to the thought leaders and Nepali influencers from around the world, please subscribe to my channel. I'm extremely pleased to welcome Dr. Britt Yamamoto in my program today. Dr. Yamamoto is a visionary leader, entrepreneur, and educator with over 2 decades of experience shaping inclusive and generative learning environments across diverse sectors. As a clinical associate professor at the University of Washington's Department of Global Health and the founding force behind international leadership organizations such as Perennial, Rootspring, and Soil, he has ignited the leadership potential within hundreds of thousands of individuals worldwide, from India to Iraq, Malawi to Mexico, and Cambodia to Canada. His transformative influence extends to nurturing deeper connections with one's work, partnerships, and self. He's soon publishing his new book, The Soil of Leadership: Cultivating the Condition for Transformation, drawing from his extensive global leadership experience, working closely with leaders and organizations from all over the world. He introduces a timely framework that places paramount importance on holistic well-being and a profound understanding of the intricate systems critical for effective and sustainable leadership. We'll talk about that book in this program today and his other inspiring works in our program. It's a pleasure to have you in my show, Dr. Yamamoto. Thank you so much for your time.
Great. Thank you, Sumit. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for that very kind introduction.
Britt, it's so fascinating to see that you are an organic farmer, a full-time professor, the founder of international nonprofit and several social enterprises, and an author. Where do you get motivation for all these things?
Yeah, well, it's a very important question. I did want to say before I get started that having just been in Nepal, spent a very transformational 1 week there just a few weeks ago, that I'm just so excited to be here and to be able to speak with you, but also just to have, I suppose, the ear of several thousands of Nepalis who might be tuning in as well. So I just had such an amazing time, and I have just so much excitement, hope, optimism for Nepalis of all ages, but certainly the next generation of Nepali youth. So what motivates me to do all those things? It's sometimes I feel like I have the answer to that question, and other times it's a bit elusive, I would say. In many ways, it really has its origins when I first, as a younger person in my early 20s, made the decision to learn about sustainable agriculture. So I actually traveled to Japan, where is technically the place of my birth. I'm fourth generation Japanese American, and my parents were living in Japan. They are born Americans, Japanese Americans as well, but were living in Japan. So I was born there, but I was only there for about 6 months before they returned to the US. And because they were working for the US military, I was technically born on American soil. So while that conversation about occupation and such is a much bigger topic, the point being is that I was born there, but truly I was never there. So in my early 20s, I had done a lot of traveling internationally, and realized that this was the time for me to not only to learn about sustainable farming, because it was something that I felt was really important for me, but also to make the trip to Japan. Mm-hmm. So it was that trip that I thought would be just about teaching me some skills maybe about farming that would really in many ways go on to be the singular formative moment or time period of my life, because it really changed the whole trajectory of what I do, how I think about the world, how I think about leadership, and to get to your question, thinking about all these multiple activities. Right. So one of the lessons were not really lessons, but one of the things I learned there that I really fell in love with was this traditional word for farmer in Japanese, which I'm sure you're familiar that in Japanese there are different kind of written formats. And Japanese borrow from Chinese characters. I use Chinese characters, which are pronounced differently, but hold the same meaning. So the now, or sort of post-war. So for many years, farmers have been called nokasan or fama, or just sort of like almost literally just farmer. It doesn't really. It's like English doesn't have any real meaning. But the traditional word for farmer that was always used was this word called hyakusho. Hyakusho. And when I learned about this, it just really, really hit deep, and just like it both named everything that I wanted to understand about the world, and also just like really imprinted on me. And that is that hyaku is 100, and sho can be translated as talents.
Okay.
So the farmer historically was the one who had 100 talents or 100 skills.
Wow.
And it's a beautiful sentiment,
Right.
And like a lot of ways in which around the world, rural culture and rural life has been discounted as important. That word became associated with sort of peasantry or not lower caste and so on. And so it sort of like fell into disrepair, so to speak. And so when I learned about this word, I just felt like this is it, this hyakusho approach. And so in many ways, it kind of gave me the framework and language to see myself as this purveyor of 100 talents or 100 skills or 100 gifts, and to focus on how to bring life to that. Right. And it would take root in different contexts. It would take root in different configurations. And so I've really tried to lead my life in such a way where it's not about the sort of like the institutional framework and trying to like live in that, but more of like an expansive, shall we say, abundance, where the 100 talents, 100 crops, 100 skills, whatever you want to say, can grow and thrive. Right. So it's really coming from this, shall you say, philosophy or framework that is, I mean, in many ways, it doesn't go further than that as a frame, but just as a way of thinking about the world, and wanting to approach my own life. So that's less maybe tactical, more conceptual, but that's sort of the origin of my, let's just say, my motivation.
Very interesting. And that's a very beautiful word, Britt. I mean, I also had an opportunity to talk with Professor Ratan Lal, World Food Prize laureate, a couple of weeks back, and, soil scientist. The importance that we have failed to provide this, the whole community of farmers and to the whole health of soil is what, is leading towards the deterioration of the entire health system as such. So I can completely relate where you're coming from, and that's really beautiful and inspiring. Thank you. Tell us about a couple of the organizations that you have set, like Perennial, Soil, and Root Spring. Why these multiple organizations?
Yeah. There's a few reasons behind that. So all of the organizations, broadly defined, are really focused on creating the conditions for individuals and institutions to experience transformation. So another story that may be helpful is really the first story I learned when I was farming in Japan.
Yeah.
And that was the difference between what we might call a conventional farmer and a sustainable farmer or an organic farmer. And this was a lesson that the farmer on the farm in Japan so kindly taught me on this very first day. And that is that the conventional farmer grows plants and the sustainable farmer grows soil. Wow. And from that departure point, you have very different set of strategies and mindsets and imaginations. Yeah. Sure. And it was a very helpful framework, of course, as literally a farmer to plan and understand what I was there to do. But it wasn't until I would go on to build organizations and lead things myself and work with leaders all around the world that I would come to see that this story, this framework, is equally, if not more, relevant to the work of how we organize ourselves and how we come together and work together to achieve something.
Right.
where it's often just focused on the plant, so to speak, the things we can see, the things that are short term, and we lose sight of the actual context in which those plants are planted. And so, as leaders, as people, really, both in the context of group life, but also in ourselves, the questions around what are the conditions, and are the conditions conducive to growth and transformation? Am I cultivating healthy soil, so to speak?
Right.
And oftentimes the answer is no. And oftentimes the answer is just on that short term. And so these various organizations and businesses, and we would call them social enterprises or social businesses, because they have very much an explicit social mission around transformation, around growth, around, in many ways, like helping people to reach their full potential, whatever that might be. And Perennial is really focused on working with like more established leaders, people that have founded things, people that are leading things, people that have the authority and influence and responsibility associated with the roles of leadership. And we've been doing that work for about 20 years. Root Spring is focused more on youth, sort of UN definition of youth, sort of like 15 to 35. And of course, that's a very different kind of population where it's perhaps living a little bit more in the conceptual, because the experience, practical experience, is a little bit less. Soil we created because it enables us to partner with organizations, businesses, and institutions, and even individuals in a way that doesn't have to fit within like a leadership training framework that both Perennial and Root Spring are focused on. So that kind of gets to the more pragmatic of why those things are there. It's very common for businesses and organizations to experience sometimes what we call mission creep, where you start to do things and then you start going here to pursue this and here to pursue this, and all of a sudden you look around and like you're doing all these things and you kind of lose track about what it is like your main core purpose is, Yeah. And so we created Soil to be able to accommodate different kinds of ways of partnering and taking on different projects. Sometimes you might think of that as like a consulting arm. And then we have a creative company that the creative company holds the book and then podcast and any other more creative endeavors. So all of these work together as like almost like a ecosystem, a family of enterprises. And that was also very intentional because and there's a holding company that sort of is the parent for all of those. And partly what we're trying to do, and this is very much really only going to be of interest to people who are more like organizational people or institutional people, is we wanted to create a model of how businesses work together or complement and augment each other. Because I personally feel that we need better models, and we need more models of how business can work together, how ideas can sort of like take root within institutional frameworks and work together. And a lot of it was just trying to be both experimental and also exemplary in that way. So the different businesses, they all work together. And even you mentioned my hat as a professor at the university. That structurally it sits outside of that ecosystem of organizations, but at the same time there is integration, and that work is very much focused on leadership and leadership development for folks around the world. So yeah, I mean, sometimes I think it only makes sense in my own head, and sometimes it doesn't make sense in my own head. So I don't know. I definitely qualify all those things by saying that it does have an experimental spirit to it. Yeah.
Yeah, and looks like all these organizations complement each other pretty well. So yeah.
On good days, yes, we should hope so. Yeah.
So, your new book, The Soil of Leadership, Cultivating the Conditions for Transformation, I think would be released in July this year.
Correct.
Tell us about this book.
The global release date is July 30th. There will also be an ebook, an audiobook, an asynchronous course. All of these things are being launched on the same day. So when I was in Nepal a few weeks ago, and had the privilege and fortune to be able to share the book with many of our graduates. So perennial graduates, we have several that are in Nepal, and being able to share the book with them, but then also some of their partners, networks, and friends that also were able to connect to the book. And if anybody follows me on Instagram, they can see some of the photos from those events, which is again just so wonderful.
Yeah, I saw that. In fact, yeah.
Yeah, it's this particular trip, I'm hitting 6 different countries, and so on my feed there's not only Nepal but Japan, Singapore, Sri Lanka, Korea, and Mongolia as well. So it's quite a collection of cross section of Asia, and even being very small. So the book Soil of Leadership is very much a collection of some of the stories and learnings that I've had over the years when it comes to approaching leadership. And I want to say, and I don't mean this to disparage anyone that's written a leadership book, or any book for that matter, because I know books are very hard to write, but I don't know that the world needs another leadership book. Which is to say that there's a lot of that out there. Some of it's kind of derivative and not particularly original. Not to suggest that mine is not derivative or not original, but more that the approach to it, where I very consciously in writing this and creating this did not want it to be a leadership manual, which is to say I wanted the book itself to actually be an experience unto itself that would model and represent the kind of content therein, which is to say that one of my beliefs is that the approach to leadership that not only do I personally advocate for, and the organizations that I lead advocate for, but in many ways that mirror the kind of experience that the leaders we've worked with over the years, is that moving forward there needs to be a greater attention to the internal world of leadership, or some of the emotional parts of leadership, and kind of getting out of our head, so to speak. And so tapping into that more internal world requires also trying to activate, to animate some of those places too. So this book is very much, it's a collection of stories. There's art, there's poetry, not just simply, again, as a presentation of leadership, but actually to try to invite people in to create a sense of receptivity. I mean, again, like this is kind of like with soil, where it's about cultivating a soil that can be receptive to something being planted in it. And so I think it's the same thing with us when we are exposed to new ideas and new things. It says less about the idea and the thing, about being an inspirational idea or an inspirational framework, and more about our receptivity to be able to actually be open to it, right? It's that openness. And so so the book itself is an invitation to that, and it's not intended to be sped read, or and again, this really reflects some of the key sentiments around it. I have a framework called so in this idea of like building healthy soil, like the naturally begs the question of like, well, how do you do that? What goes into building healthy soil? So our framework for soil building is really built on these 3 ingredients. We say time, space, and relationships.
Okay.
And reorienting ourselves to that. So time, just as a sort of a quick thumbnail, as leaders, as managers, as people, we're often in these places of reactivity. The compression of our ability to respond to things is so significant that we don't have the opportunity to even reflect, never mind like actually come up with like thoughtful, discerning responses to things. And so so there's a whole framework that we advocate for called reflective practice, which helps to, in some ways, like slow down, or help leaders to slow down time a bit, or to shift their orientation to it. So time. The second one is space. Sometimes I use the metaphor of a fire when thinking about spaciousness. So if you think about how you build a fire, it's not the logs that actually create the fire, it's the spaces in between the logs.
Right.
It's allowing for that air to flow. It's allowing for the sort of nothingness, so to speak, right? Which is, sort of Buddhist in its orientation as well. But this idea of spaciousness and reorienting ourselves to space,
Mm-hmm.
and then finally relationship, both relationship to others and how we think about our collaborations and such, but also our relationship to self. And so well-being is a very important part of our approach to leadership development, awareness building, something we call social construction, and how we effectively, which that's very much an academic term, but basically the idea of how we come to know what we know, how we collectively agree upon things, and how we internalize those frameworks, whether they be, collectively agreeing upon what an apple is, or more importantly in our work, like, how do we understand something like leadership? Like, what does a leader look
Right.
like? Where did you get that idea from? And you've internalized it in such a way that you are just, you are performing your idea of what a leader is, but maybe you're not even aware of where that story came from. And there's a
Mm-hmm.
relationship between that story and that strategy. So the book itself is, again, it's getting to these really important concepts, but it's trying to do it in a way that is activating a different way that we move through the world, which again is, the way of talking about it is through your heart versus through your head.
Right. So, as far as I have understood, would I be correct to say that is it more of a suggestion for internal reengineering rather than looking outwards? Would that be correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're correct. I think it's maybe less of an either or and a both and. It's like sometimes the way to use the metaphor, like farmers can't just grow soil. Like you got to grow plants too, right? Otherwise, you're not going to be able to farm very long. So it's not to suggest that we shouldn't focus on growing plants, but our work tends to do that, and it tends to come at the expense of, or of a lack of attention to use the metaphor, the soil. And so, like in the context of leadership, sometimes we say how we're connecting the who you are with what you do.
Mm-hmm.
So, as I'm coming to know you, Sumit, I know that you're very much rooted in very clear purpose about trying to do something very important. It's not about yourself; it's about a larger purpose, right? And so, that why is what's animating you. It's what you're planted in, so to speak. It's where if we say you're a tree, it's where your roots draw their sustenance, right? And so it's really about what that relationship is that draws we say roots before fruits, because we're just focusing on your outputs. And we, whatever, it's like, how many podcast interviews can you do? How many, if that's what our works, if that's what we're focused on, and we lose sight about, well, why are you doing this in the first place? At some point, you are going to find yourself very far adrift from that. And you may find yourself in, like, I don't even know why I do this in the first place. And so this has been one of the very unique experiences that I've had. And I've had the privilege to be able to work with leaders all over the world, in Asia, Africa, Latin America, North America, the Middle East, and thousands of them over the years. And so I've had the privilege to be able to kind of see some of these common themes, where it doesn't matter if you're in Iraq or India or Indiana in the United States. There's something about that when you drift from that purpose, and there's different reasons why that happens, and sometimes it's unavoidable, but when you drift from that purpose and you start to develop a big wide gap there, it becomes very hard to sustain the work. And in many ways, my work, it's about helping leaders to sustain themselves, whether they're 15 or 55 or 85. And, apologies for using you as an example again, but, what I'll often say is that, as leaders, as people who have committed their lives to trying to advance something, that you are very important, which is to say, like, your work touches thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives, and you are not replaceable. So if you burn out, if you can't continue doing the work you do for whatever reason, that's a significant loss.
True.
And it's not just easy to just find another person to put in there. And whether it's, inspiring people, helping them to understand new frameworks and all of that, or if it's climate change or something that feels like an existential threat. My own belief is, while yes, that may be true, the existential response is actually a human one, which is to say people are going to be the ones, the climate's going to be just fine. It's people who are going to suffer. And so what's necessary is a human intervention, at least all humans. And of course, any other current life form that may be, sentient in its form and will suffer perhaps as a result of our behavior. But it needs people. It needs people. It needs people to lead. It needs people to follow. It needs people to step up. And those people are not easily replaceable. And so this question of how do you sustain yourself? How do you actually see yourself as a sustainable farmer, where you are thinking about planting over time as opposed to how can I extract the most out of this right now in this season? Because again, that framework is limiting. And not only is it limiting, and it kind of gets to the young people thing. And this, again, I saw this very clearly in the young people I interacted with in Nepal, and that I have seen for many years now. Young people know better. Young people are rejecting this idea that leadership has to be the way it's always been. And while many people may lack the examples of what the options might be, there is a very clear rejection. And this is, again, across the board of we will not participate in that form of leadership anymore. And there's different ways that shows up. But I think as let's just call ourselves older people, understanding that's important, but also just to recognize that, and this is where I felt very inspired by the young people I interact with in Nepal. It's but also to help not only give them the language and the frameworks and the imagination, but to actually help create the structures for people to be able to do that, the young people to be able to do that, So yeah, so it's kind of a long rant about what the book is about, but it really tried to get at some of those deeper elements. And I've been very, very pleased with how the sort of initial response has been from the people that are reading it, and how they're finding it to be something that is important in that way. And that's really what the book was written for, to try and elicit that kind of response.
Right. I mean, it's a very interesting sort of perspective on the whole idea of leadership itself, because as you rightly pointed out, we had been going through a lot of leadership stuffs in the past books that's more oriented towards enhancing your skills, many things related to externalities of personalities, I would say. But it would be interesting to look at from how to sort of balance both. I was interested to ask, what emerging trends are you most excited about in your field right now?
That's a great question. So, I mentioned that one of the key pillars of our work is around well-being, which is to say this sort of more holistic approach to someone's overall wellness, and whether it's coming out of COVID and the experience people have had with just their own health, orientation to life, ability to continue on doing what they do. It has been, it's been nice to see how, whether they're companies or organizations, but even just in the general zeitgeist of places where it's people are talking about their well-being. Now, it needs to kind of be perhaps a slightly more nuanced conversation. And, if we had more time, I would be happy to talk about that. But that's not something you saw 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, talking about well-being, or how do we come up with programs that care for people's overall wellness, right? And whether that's mental, emotional health, physical health, sort of collaboratively how our systems may be enhancing or detracting from people's health. Those are really important conversations. And so I think we're very much in the sort of like the initial stages of that, and a lot of the interventions tend to be somewhat transactional or very like individualized, and that's one of the challenges that I see. It's kind of like, self-care, which is something people talk a lot about, where it's like, okay, you take care of yourself, and that's how you care for your well-being, which is is important to do. But again, this is very much like a both and thing, and if the systems themselves are causing the lack of health, then we need to also be looking at how do we change those systems, right? So well-being, I would say, is really the thing I think is the most exciting, the emphasis on well-being.
Well, Britt, I mean, on that note, I'd like to thank you for your time. I'd like to wish you good luck for your book. You told me you are traveling again back to Nepal. We should catch up, and then,
Absolutely.
Wish you good luck for all the work, great work that you are doing, Britt. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I had a really great time, and I appreciate the questions. Thank you.
Thank you.